Welcome to another deep dive. This one might seem a bit, well, historical.
Oh,
We're going back to 1964.
okay.
Yeah, using a book by Morris Janowitz.
I know Janowitz.
Yeah, The Military and the Political Development of New Nations.
Ah, classic.
It is, but here's the thing.
Yeah.
It's scary how much it still applies today.
I'm intrigued. What's the angle we're taking?
Imagine you're advising a brand new country, like just got independence. What do they need to know about their military?
That's a great way to frame it. Because it's not just about, like, tanks and guns, right? It's about the whole relationship between the military and the
The government, the
the
people.
whole system. Yeah.
Exactly. So to start, when Janowitz talks about these new nations,
Yeah.
who's he actually talking about?
He's mostly focused on those countries in Africa and Asia
Okay.
that got their independence or modernized really fast
Yeah.
after World War II.
It's not like a formal category, though.
No, not like developed or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
It's more about the shared experience they were all going through. Similar economic problems,
Yeah.
social stuff.
Right.
But the biggest one, I think, was figuring out the military.
Like where it fits in once you're not fighting for freedom anymore.
Exactly. How do you go from an army of, revolutionaries to an army that actually helps build a stable nation?
And that's not an easy transition. What I find interesting is who Janowitz doesn't include.
Oh.
Latin America.
Oh, yeah.
They had tons of coups, military involvement in politics.
Right, right. But their history's different.
Total.
They got independent way earlier. So by the time Janowitz is writing, their civil military, how they work together, it had already evolved along a different path,
He's zeroing in on that post-World War II wave.
where things were still raw, like figuring it out as they went.
So let's get into those raw issues. Janowitz starts with this concept of
Legitimacy.
legitimacy, right? Seems simple,
Okay.
but huge GE for new nations. Why is it so important, especially when we're talking about the military?
Okay, so legitimacy is, at its core, whether people believe their leaders have the right to actually rule.
Like, do they deserve to be in charge?
Exactly. It's the bedrock of any government. But imagine a country where everyone thinks, man, these guys are phonies.
Damn.
Guaranteed. And for new nations, it's even more fragile. They've just gone through revolutions, independence struggles, huge upheaval,
The old way is gone.
gone.
But the new one's still got to prove itself.
And the military gets tangled up in this legitimacy question in a really interesting way.
Because they're the ones with the guns, right?
In a way, yeah. On one hand, the military being organized, using force, they can be a powerful symbol, right? Like authority.
So a new government might use them to show strength, especially if things are shaky.
Exactly. Project that control.
Yeah.
But here's the paradox Janowitz is getting at.
Okay.
This book is about how the military can help these new nations modernize with, and this is key, as little force as possible.
That seems kind of backwards. You'd think strong army equals they just impose order? Done.
Right. But Janowitz is saying no.
So why? Why emphasize this less forceful approach?
Because real lasting stability, it comes from people being persuaded, not just forced. If you want a nation to develop, grow, people got to buy into the system, not be scared into it.
So you're saying the military can be part of that, but under the right conditions.
Exactly. And those conditions, that's all about what kind of civil-military relationship you've got going on.
Okay, so we need to define that. What does a quote-unquote healthy relationship look like?
Janowitz starts by, well, he looks at how the industrialized nations did it,
Okay,
just to give us a comparison point.
makes sense.
He finds three basic models that were common in the West. So first, you've got the democratic model, probably most familiar to us.
Like the U.S., Europe?
Yeah, military's there for defense, foreign policy, they stay out of domestic stuff. Clear separation, civilian leaders, military leaders.
Elected officials make the calls, military carries it out. Classic.
But that's not the only way to do things.
So I figured. What else is there?
There's the aristocratic model.
Aristocratic.
Yeah, think old school Europe, knights, nobles, all that.
Okay.
Military and aristocracy were like totally intertwined. Shared ideology, shared interest. Control wasn't about rules so much. It was about like social bonds.
Interesting. So less about laws, more about who you know, who you're related to.
Exactly. And then there's the third model, which, the 20th century showed us how real this one can get. The totalitarian model.
Totalitarian.
Here, the military is like a tool of the one-party state. They might get tons of resources, influence, but They're also tightly controlled. Secret police, party members in the ranks, constant surveillance.
So the party uses them, but also is scared of them.
Big time. They know a powerful military could turn on them, so they keep it on a very short leash.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. With all three of these models, none of them quite fit what was happening in these new nations.
Because their situation was so different.
Totally. Their militaries were often way more prominent, playing a bigger role in everything, even daily life.
So Janowitz had to come up with something new.
He did. He went beyond those existing models and created a framework specifically for these newly independent or rapidly modernizing countries. He gets into 5 distinct types, which is what we're going to get into next.
I am ready. From least to most military power.
You got it. And remember, thinking back to that advisor role, each type comes with its own like opportunities and dangers.
All right, hit me with type 1.
Authoritarian personal control. Pretty much what it sounds like. The military's job is to keep one leader in power.
Like a strongman kind of thing.
Exactly. Often a charismatic dude rose to power during the independence fight, revolution, something like that.
Got any example?
Early Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. Or South Vietnam, Nunga Dinh Diem.
Okay, so you've got this powerful figure.
Yeah.
And the army's there to make sure nobody messes with him.
Basically, this type often pops up when a country's facing threats, instability. The leader leans on the military for security, then uses that power to make his own position stronger.
So if I'm advising a new nation and I see this happening, what should I be worried about?
The big question is, does this reliance on the military actually hurt the country in the long run?
How so?
Can you build a real democracy, a strong economy, all that good stuff, when one person is calling all the shots, backed up by guns? That's the dilemma.
That's a good point to ponder. All right, we got authoritarian personal control. What's next?
Type 2, authoritarian mass party control. Kind of similar, but instead of one big leader, it's the party that's in charge.
Ah, okay. Less about one person's charisma, more about the ideology, the organization.
Exactly. Think communist states or those single-party regimes that were common in Africa back then.
So the military's role is different here.
Yeah, they're often smaller, not as well equipped, and you see a counterbalance, like a strong police force, paramilitaries, all loyal to the party.
Sounds like they want to keep the army in check.
Oh yeah, they see him as a potential threat, limit their resources, keep him on a tight leash. Now for type 3,
Hit me.
this is the one everyone hopes for. Democratic, competitive.
Where the military stays out of politics.
Even during elections.
Yeah.
They respect the civilian government, focus on defense.
That's the ideal.
It is, but rare.
Especially back then.
Janowitz highlights India in the 60s, though.
Really?
Yeah, despite all their problems, they made it work. Democracy, military, mostly stayed in its lane. Shows it can be done.
Encouraging. All right, what about type 4?
This one's trickier. Civil-military coalition.
Coalition.
The military is a major player, but alongside other groups. Political parties, unions, you name it.
So they're at the table,
Big time.
but not running the whole show yet.
That's the question. Is it stable? Can they stay a partner, or do they inevitably take over? Type 5 brings us to that takeover scenario.
I'm guessing that's full-on military rule.
Yep. Military oligarchy. Straightforward. The military IS. The government. Might have some civilian window dressing.
But the top brass calls the shots.
100%. Janowitz's main example for this one is Egypt in the early 60s under Nasser.
Ah, right. His free officers movement.
Took over a decade earlier. Military was firmly in charge.
So if we're advising a new nation and we see this pattern,
Yeah.
what are the red flags?
Well, even within military oligarchy, there's variation. Some are super obvious about it. Others try to look more civilian. The key is to look past the labels, understand how they got there, how they rule.
Nuance, 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 always.
So we've got these 5 types, from propping up one leader to full-on military rule. But as advisors, does this just mean we slap a label on a country and call it a day?
Nope. Janowitz gives us this cool tool, but then he takes it further. He actually puts 51 new nations as of 1963 into these categories, like a snapshot of the world.
So we can see the trends. What's common, what's surprising, what our new nation needs to watch out for.
Exactly. You might think with all the talk about democracy that democratic competitive type would be everywhere.
Yeah.
Not even close. The most common were the authoritarian ones, which is scary. Shows how fragile things are early on. Good point. But there's more to it than just labeling, right? Can't just say, oh, it's authoritarian personal control and move on.
You got it. Janowitz says these categories are just the start. We got to consider the specifics, the history, the politics, even the culture of each place. He lays out 3 big factors that are super insightful.
Lay 'em on me. What's the first one?
Seems obvious, but people forget it. Historical background. Lumping all new nations together is silly. Their pasts are totally different.
Right. So how does he break it down?
3 main areas, each with a different relationship to, like, military power.
Okay. Area number 1?
South and Southeast Asia. This is where colonialism hit the hardest, totally reshaped everything. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Even with centuries of kingdoms and empires, military rule wasn't, like, super ingrained in their culture.
Which is weird because they had a lot of coups and stuff later on.
Right. Makes you think maybe strong rulers in the past doesn't automatically mean the military will always dominate. Colonialism kind of messed with that. It created a void that new armies had to fill.
So their history isn't destiny. What about area 2?
Middle East and North Africa, totally different story. Long tradition of the military being in politics. Ottomans, caliphates, all that. Military leaders were often tied to religion, too, had a big say in how things were run.
So that legacy kind of carried over, even after independence.
Big time. And colonialism, while impactful, didn't reshape them as much as Southeast Asia. Those old ways of thinking about power, they stuck around.
So if you're advising a nation there,
Yeah.
got to be aware of that history of the military being involved. Okay, what's area 3?
Sub-Saharan Africa. Unique case because by the time they got independent, they had almost no indigenous military tradition left. Centuries of slave trade, then brutal colonialism wiped it all out.
So starting from scratch, but not in a good way.
Right. They had to build armies from nothing, often copying foreign models, which came with its own problems.
Dependence on other countries, stuff like that.
Exactly. So 3 very different historical contexts. South and Southeast Asia, colonialism disrupted things. Middle East, military involvement was already there. Sub-Saharan Africa, they had to invent it all.
No easy answers there, but I bet there's more.
Oh yeah, this is just layer 1. Janowitz's second big factor is about the origin of the military itself. How that army came to be matters a lot.
So even within a region, it's different.
5 types he lays out, and this is where it gets super nuanced, crucial for our advisor role. First up, non-colonial armies
Non-colonial.
grew organically without being forced on them by a colonial power. Think Thailand, never colonized, or Ethiopia fought off the Italians.
So they have that connection to the past.
Strong sense of tradition, national pride.
But can they adapt to the modern world?
That's the challenge, right? They might resist change, struggle to modernize.
Okay, what's origin type 2?
Ex-colonial armies. These are the ones inherited directly from, well, the colonizers.
Yeah.
British model, French model, it all makes a difference.
So trained by the British act differently than trained by the French.
Oh, huge difference. British were all about professionalism, separate military from civilian stuff. French, more hands-on, military keeps order, projects power.
Wow. So the colonial past still shapes things even after they're gone.
Like a ghost, lingering.
All right, origin type 3.
National liberation armies, born out of the fight for freedom. Guerrilla groups, resistance movements, they become the army.
I can see how those guys would get political.
Oh yeah, they see themselves as protectors, guardians of the revolution. Super suspicious of the old elites, anyone who seems like a sellout.
Makes sense. They fought for this. They're not going to let it slip away. Okay, what's type 4?
Post-liberation armies. Created after independence is already won. Different challenge. They get professionalized fast, build up their strength, prove they're legit.
From scratch, basically.
Ghana's a good example. Form their army after they were already free from Britain.
Tough job, right? Limited resources, maybe needing help from other countries.
Which creates its own dependencies. It's tricky.
Need an army, but don't want to be reliant on someone else.
Exactly. And finally, type 5.
Hit me.
Reflects how messy the post-colonial world is. Post-colonial with significant ex-colonial elements.
A bit of a mouthful.
Basically, a mix. New core, but lots of holdovers from the colonial days. Officers who served the old regime, equipment, even ways of thinking.
Pension City.
Oh, yeah. Old guard versus new blood. Janowitz uses South Vietnam as an example.
Yeah.
Post-liberation army.
Yeah.
But tons of officers had served in the French army before. Talk about divided loyalties.
Okay, to sum up our origins. Non-colonial, ex-colonial, national liberation, post-liberation, and this hybrid one, each with its own, baggage.
And each influencing how they act on the political stage. As advisors, Got to know the origin story.
Yeah.
It's not just where a country IIS, it's where they've come from.
Adds a whole layer of complexity. Okay, so we got history, we got origins. What's the third big thing Janowitz says to consider?
This one might seem off at first, but it's huge. Economic development. Now, here's the usual thought. Richer country equals more likely to be democratic. Military stays out of things.
Makes sense. Strong economy, less need for the army to get involved.
But Janowitz throws a curveball. The link between economics and the military's role is way more complicated.
Really? So booming economy doesn't equal hands-off army?
Not always. He does say that in super poor countries, you often see what he calls personalist rule. One leader relies on the military to survive.
Like we talked about, authoritarian personal control. When there's not much to go around, power gets concentrated.
And the military often becomes the decider.
But it gets weird after that, right?
But once you get past that extreme poverty, the link between economics and military intervention, it gets murky.
So a country doing better economically could still have a coup just as easily as a peaceful democracy.
That's what Janowitz found. Development doesn't guarantee anything. In some cases, it might even make military intervention more likely.
Now that doesn't make sense. You'd think prosperity equals less need for a takeover.
Seems that way, but here's why it might happen. As an economy grows, the military often wants more. Better equipment, more pay, more say in how things are run.
So their appetite grows along with the economy.
You got it. And if the civilian leaders are seen as corrupt or failing to deliver, that creates tension.
The military thinks, we deserve more, we can do better.
Right. Plus, economic growth often brings social change, urbanization, new elites, all of which can destabilize things. Military might step in to restore order, and some people might even cheer them on.
It's not just money, it's what comes with the money.
The social and political changes. And that's why Janowitz says you can't give economic advice without considering the politics. Boosting a country's GDP doesn't mean the military will just sit back and watch. It's all intertwined.
Okay, so to recap our big three factors: historical background, origin of the military, and this complex economic development thing. No simple answers there.
Nope. They're more like tools to help us understand how complicated this all is. Avoid making dumb assumptions.
But there's more to it than just the context, right? We got to look inside the military itself, what's going on in their heads.
Exactly. Janowitz doesn't just look at the big picture. He goes deep into the military as an organization, and it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for another deep dive. What does he focus on?
Everything. Their structure, their skills, where they recruit from, education, even their ideology. He wants to know what makes them tick.
Let's start with structure then. What do these armies look like in practice?
Well, keep in mind, it's 1964. No fancy drones or cyber warfare yet. Most of them are built on the World War II infantry model. Boots on the ground, basic combat skills, clear chain of command.
Old school, but effective.
And their experience level varies a lot. Some, like in Burma, had seen tons of combat. Others, barely any.
I can see how that would make a difference. Battle-hardened versus parade ground soldiers.
And here's another thing. They really wanted to be seen as different from the police. Soldiers, not cops.
Why is that? Just pride, or something deeper?
Janowitz says it's partly pride, but it has consequences. By not doing the messy stuff, repressing civilians, they keep this image of themselves as a clean force.
But that also makes them more likely to intervene in a big way when they DO-act, right?
You got it. They haven't been tarnished by the dirty work, so they can step in, looking like the good guys, acting for the nation. Makes them harder to resist.
That's a smart point. It's like they're saving up their legitimacy for a rainy day. Okay, what about their skills, though? Does military training actually prepare you to run a country?
Good question. Janowitz says it's a mixed bag. Some skills transfer, like logistics, planning, handling crises. But there are also big limits.
Like what?
Well, military training is all about hierarchy, following orders, making quick decisions, great for a battlefield, not so much for a politician who needs to build consensus, compromise, all that messy stuff.
So, are military leaders doomed to fail in government, then?
Not necessarily. Janowitz actually points to a certain kind of officer who's more likely to have the right stuff. He calls them adaptive career officers.
Adaptive career. What makes them different?
They've had experiences that force them to think outside the box, adapt to new situations, foreign postings, where they had to deal with different cultures. Maybe they worked with new technologies, learned to adapt quickly.
More flexible, more politically aware.
Exactly. They've seen more, had to deal with more, so they understand the world better. And Janowitz says these are the guys who might actually do well in a civilian role.
Like cabinet ministers, diplomat, even leading the country. So it's not impossible, but it takes a specific kind of military background.
Okay, what about where they come from? Their social class, does that matter?
Big time. And it's different from, like, old Europe. Most of these new nations, there's no feudal aristocracy, no hereditary knights calling the shots.
So where do these officers come from? Mostly middle-class backgrounds, often rural roots, sons of teachers, small landowners, that kind of thing. A new generation, often the first to get higher education.
So they're ambitious, driven to succeed. How does that shape their worldview?
Well, on one hand, it makes them modernizers. They want progress. They want their countries to be successful. They're not stuck in the past. But on the other hand, it also makes them distrustful of elites, intellectuals, politicians who they see as out of touch.
Ah, so that explains some of the tension between the military and civilian leaders. They come from different worlds, different values.
Exactly. And that distrust can be a big driver for intervention. They don't just want power. They want to fix things.
Okay, so social background matters. What about their education?
Another key point. And again, different from Europe. Most of these officers, they don't come from purely military schools. They have a civilian education as their base. University degrees, engineering, law, even literature.
So wider range of ideas, exposed to different ways of thinking.
Right. Makes them more well-rounded, but also means they've been thinking about politics from a young age.
They're not just learning how to fight. They're learning about how the world works.
And that shapes how they see the military's role. Now, when it comes to their actual ideology,
Yeah, like their core beliefs about the military and society.
Janowitz says there's no one military ideology, but there are some common threads.
Like what?
Strong nationalism, for one. They're defenders of the nation. That's their core identity. Also a big emphasis on hard work, discipline, efficiency, a sense of duty, almost like a puritanical work ethic, but not in the religious sense.
I can see how that clashes with how some governments work, especially if they're corrupt or inefficient.
Big time. And that leads to another key part of their ideology. Distrust of politicians. We've talked about it, but it's really important. They see politicians as corrupt, self-serving, more interested in lining their pockets than serving the country.
We've talked about why they might think that, but is it just cynicism or something more?
Janowitz says it often comes from a genuine desire to see their country succeed. They're patriotic. They want things to work. They get frustrated when leaders fail to live up to their ideals.
So they think they can do better?
Sometimes, yeah. And that's where it gets dangerous. That belief, mixed with their distrust of politicians and their sense of duty, it can make intervention very tempting.
A recipe for a coup right there. Belief in their own competence, skepticism of the civilians, and that sense of mission. But how does it actually happen? What are the mechanics of a military takeover? So we've got all these factors pushing a military towards taking over their history, what's going on inside the military, even the economy. But how does a coup actually go down? Do they just show up one morning and announce it?
You'd be surprised. But Janowitz, he breaks it down into two main types. Calls them designed and reactive, and they're pretty different.
Design militarism sounds like a planned thing, right? Officers plotting in secret, like a spy movie.
Exactly. Think of it like a well-organized coup. They have a plan, a core group of leaders, and lots of support within the military. Like Nasser's free officers in Egypt. They spent years building up to it before they finally made their move in '52, got rid of the king.
So it takes brains, not just brawn. What about reactive militarism? Is that more spur of the moment?
It is, and it's way more common in these new countries. It's not so much a plan, more like reacting to a crisis.
Yeah.
The military sees the country falling apart, chaos, maybe the economy's tanking, violence in the streets. They think, we're the only ones who can fix this, and boom, they take over.
So they frame it as duty saving the nation.
Exactly. A patriotic act, even if they might actually believe it. Pakistan's a good example. They had a bunch of coups that were more reactive than planned, usually triggered by some mess like political deadlock, corruption scandals, or the economy going haywire.
Makes you think if the civilian government had done a better job, maybe the military wouldn't have felt they had to step in.
That's a big point Janowitz makes. It's not just about the military being willing to take over. It's about what makes it easy for them to do it. And here's a weird one. He found that coups almost never happen against one-party states.
Wait, really? That's surprising. Those regimes seem like they'd be prime targets.
It does, right. But think about it. Those one-party states, whether they're communist or whatever, they're really good at controlling the military. They put their own people in the ranks. They have their own security forces to keep the army in check. They use propaganda, surveillance, the whole 9 yards. They know a coup is possible, so they work hard to prevent it.
So they're so afraid of it, they actually stop it from happening.
Kind of ironic, right? It shows you how much power is about perception. And it's something for you as our advisor to think about. If you're helping build a new nation, you got to be smart about the balance of power. Not just between the military and the civilians, but between everyone. Different parts of the government, different political parties, all the groups that make up society.
Keep everyone in check so no one gets too powerful.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about things inside a country that can cause coups. But what about outside influences? Does Janowitz get into foreign policy?
I was just thinking that, like, these new nations aren't just dealing with their own problems, they're stepping onto a world stage that's already pretty messed up.
Right. And Janowitz hits on this. Remember, it's the Cold War. U.S. and Soviet Union are fighting for influence everywhere, offering aid, military support, all that. And that puts a ton of pressure on these new nations and their militaries.
So it's not just about who's in charge at home, it's about navigating global politics and trying not to get crushed in the process.
Exactly. Think about military aid. If a country depends on one superpower for weapons and training, that creates leverage. The military might feel like they have to keep that patron happy, even if it means going against their own government.
So a foreign power could actually encourage a coup, use the local military to get what they want.
Happened all the time during the Cold War. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, you name it. One side backs a coup to get a friendly regime in power. The other side tries to destabilize things. Super dangerous game.
And for these new countries, it's like trying to learn to walk while balancing on a tightrope.
It's rough. Janowitz suggests that one way to avoid this mess is to get support from multiple countries. That way, you're not beholden to just one. It gives you more options, more independence.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Smart.
And it's still relevant today, even though the Cold War is over. You've got China, India, the EU, all competing for influence. It's a multipolar world now.
More complicated in a way.
For sure. But the idea is the same. Don't rely on just one power. Build relationships, diversify your support, and keep your options open. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Different types of coups, things that make them likely, foreign policy, the whole global context. But the big question is, can it be prevented? Can these new nations be stable and successful without the military constantly messing with politics?
That's what everyone wants to know. Can we avoid this whole cycle of coup and instability?
That's the million-dollar question.
Mm.
And Janowitz, he doesn't give us a simple answer. But he does talk about some conditions that make what he calls political balance more likely. It's where the military does its job defending the country, but doesn't try to run everything.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does a healthy relationship between the military and the government look like?
The first thing, and it's the most important, is civilian control of the military. But it's not just about having a civilian leader in charge. It's about making sure the military itself respects civilian authority. They understand their place in a democracy. They follow the decisions of elected officials, even when they disagree.
So clear rules, professional standards, checks and balances, all that good stuff.
Right. And that's hard to do, especially when the military was so important in winning independence, or when they think they're the only ones who can protect the country. They might think they're above politics, that they know best.
Like, who watches the watchmen? You got to make sure even the guys with guns are accountable to the people. What else makes this political balance more likely?
Janowitz calls the second thing internal professionalism. It's all about creating a culture of merit, competence, and doing things the right way inside the military. Clear standards for everything, from recruitment and training to promotions and discipline. And those standards have to be applied fairly, no matter who you know or what your political views are.
So a professional military that's focused on defending the country, not on personal gain or political power.
Exactly. And it means emphasizing education, both military and civilian, encouraging critical thinking, teaching ethical behavior. You want officers who are not just good at fighting, but who are also thoughtful, responsible leaders who understand the world.
It's like you're describing a new breed of military leader, someone who can operate in both the military and civilian worlds.
Right. Someone who can work with civilian leaders, who respects the law, and who knows that their loyalty is to the Constitution and the people, not to some political party or ideology.
That's a great goal. But is it realistic? It seems super hard to achieve, especially for these new countries that are dealing with so many other problems.
It is tough. But Janowitz gives some examples of countries that did manage to find that balance. where the military played a positive role without taking over. India, like we talked about before, is a good example. They had huge challenges, but they made democracy work, and the military mostly stayed in its lane.
That gives me some hope, but it sounds like it takes a lot of things going right. Good leadership, commitment to democracy, and a bit of luck, maybe.
You got it. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every country is different. But Janowitz gives us a way to think about these problems, to analyze what's going on, and to try to find solutions that will work.
It's like a roadmap, not a set of instructions.
Exactly. It helps us understand how the military and the government should interact, and it shows us the dangers of letting things get out of balance.
Okay, so imagine I'm that advisor again, sitting with the leaders of this new nation. They want to build a successful country, a democracy that works. What do I tell them?
What's the most important advice you'd give them, based on all we've learned from Janowitz?
Well, first, I'd tell them to really understand their own history. Don't just try to copy what other countries have done. What worked for India might not work somewhere else. Every country has to find its own path.
Know thyself, right?
Exactly. And then I'd tell them to build a military that's strong and professional, but keep it under control. Invest in training, education, all that, but don't give them a free pass. Make sure the civilians are in charge. Set clear limits on what the military can and can't do.
Find that balance between a capable military and a strong democracy.
Exactly. And lastly, I'd remind them that building a successful country takes time. There are going to be problems, setbacks, maybe even crises. But if they stick to their principles, take care of their people, and build institutions that work, they have a real shot at making it.
Well said. It's a message of hope, but also a challenge. It reminds us that the future isn't set in stone. We have to create it day by day through our choices and our actions.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the military in new nations. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. We've covered a lot of ground, from types of military rule to the factors that shape how things work out, from how coups happen to what a balanced system might look like.
It's been a great discussion, and I hope it's got people thinking about how important it is to get this relationship between the military and society right.
If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out Janowitz's book. It's a tough read, but it's full of smart insights that are still relevant today. And remember, figuring out how to have a military that serves the people, not the other way around, is something we have to keep working on all the time, everywhere.
It's a constant effort, and there's always more to learn.
Well, that's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.